declassified billing records, tracking money that disappeared from Medicare accounts like smoke through a screen door. 18 years of that. So yes, after all of it, I wanted roses. My name is Loretta Voss. I am 63 years old. I live in a pale yellow house on a quiet street in Savannah, Georgia, 2 blocks from the hospital where my husband Clarence spent the last 4 months of his life. I buried him 11 months before that lawsuit arrived. And I will tell you something honestly. Grief at 63 feels entirely different than people expect. It doesn't always announce itself loudly. Most days it just sits beside you at the kitchen table while you drink your coffee, quiet and uninvited, like a neighbor who forgot to go home. Clarence was a good man. Not perfect. Good. He laughed too loud at his own jokes. He left cabinet doors open all over the house, every single morning without fail for 31 years. He burned toast so consistently that our smoke detector essentially became a kitchen timer. But he was steady. He was kind to strangers in that easy, natural way some Southern men carry from childhood, the kind that isn't performance, just habit. And he loved that dental practice with everything he had. His father had started it. Small office on Whitaker Street, 4 chairs, a waiting room with magazines nobody ever updated, and a receptionist named Dolers who had worked there since Reagan's first term. Clarence took it over at 32 and spent the next 3 decades making it something real. Not fancy, real. The kind of place where people brought their children because their parents had gone there. Where Dolers knew every patient's name and half their family history. When Clarence got sick, that practice became the thing his family fought over before he was even gone. His sister, Patricia Voss Henley, had never shown much interest in the practice while Clarence was healthy. She lived 40 minutes away in a newer neighborhood with a bigger house and a husband named Douglas who sold commercial real estate and spoke exclusively in golf metaphors. Patricia was polished in that particular way that takes real effort to maintain. Perfect highlights, perfect posture. The kind of woman who arrives at family dinners with store-bought pie in a dish she's transferred to her own ceramic so it looks homemade. After Clarence's diagnosis, Patricia started visiting more. At first, I thought it was love. I genuinely did. She would sit beside his recliner and hold his hand and talk about their childhood, the old neighborhood, their parents. Clarence seemed to enjoy it. He was tired most of the time and conversation kept him present. I would bring sweet tea and leave them to it, grateful honestly that he had company when I needed to step outside and breathe. It took me 3 visits to notice the pattern. Every single time, without fail, the conversation would eventually find its way to the practice. Just gently, just casually. Patricia asking about the lease renewal, about whether Clarence had thought about what happened to the building if things didn't improve, about whether it might be sensible to transfer certain assets while everything was still straightforward. Each time, Clarence would get quiet. And each time, I would come back into the room and Patricia would smoothly change the subject to something warm and unrelated. I am not a suspicious woman by nature, but I spent 18 years identifying patterns in data that people tried very hard to hide. And a pattern is a pattern whether it shows up in billing records or a sister's Sunday visits. I didn't say anything to Clarence immediately. He was exhausted and in pain, and I was not going to add worry to that. But I started paying closer attention. The attached apartment above the practice was what this was really about. I understood that eventually. The practice itself was valuable, but the apartment was something else. Clarence had renovated it himself over 2 summers, back when our daughter Simone was in middle school. He'd replaced the floors, repainted every room, installed good windows. His plan always was that it would be income property, rental money to supplement retirement. We had talked about it for years, that apartment, like a quiet promise we were keeping to our future selves. After Clarence died, Patricia moved fast. She contested the estate within 6 weeks. Her attorney filed a petition claiming that Clarence had expressed, verbally, an intention to transfer partial ownership of the practice building to her before his death, and that I had interfered with that process. The language was careful and legal and designed to sound reasonable. Undue influence. Disputed verbal agreement. Estate irregularities. I read the filing twice at my kitchen table. Then I set it down and looked out the window at the roses. Patricia had made the same mistake that certain people always make about quiet women. She saw the cardigan and the garden and the retirement, and she thought she understood exactly who she was dealing with. She did not. My daughter Simone called that evening. She is 37, a physical therapist, practical and direct in the way that middle children sometimes become when they grow up watching adults complicate simple things. She had driven over after work and was sitting across from me at the kitchen table with her reading glasses still pushed up on her head and a look on her face that I recognized from her teenage years. That particular combination of worry and determination. Mom, she has lawyers. Real ones. Douglas probably paid for them already. Probably, I agreed. You need to at least talk to someone, an attorney. I stirred my tea slowly. I know some people. Simone gave me a look. You know some people from your garden club? I smiled faintly. Not exactly. She leaned forward. Mom, what does that mean? Here is the thing about keeping a professional life private. You do it long enough, it becomes genuine habit. Clarence knew everything, of course. Every case, every late night, every federal courtroom in 4 different states. He had been proud in that quiet, specific way of his, never boasting to anyone, just occasionally smiling when people underestimated me at dinner parties. But Simone knew only the outline. Government work, legal affairs, federal agency. She had never pushed for details and I had never offered them, and somewhere along the way that became just the shape of our family. Handle it, I told her. Aunt Patricia has connections, Mom. She knows people on the hospital board. Douglas plays golf with half the county. Simone. I looked at her steadily. I'll handle it. She stared at me for a long moment, then something in her face shifted slightly, not full understanding, just the beginning of a question she hadn't thought to ask before. Who exactly did you work for? She asked carefully. I picked up my tea. The federal government. She waited. Healthcare division, I added. She waited some more. Fraud investigations, I said finally, and left it there. You're listening to the quiet drama. The quiet ones always have the loudest stories. 2 weeks after the filing, Patricia invited the extended family to Sunday dinner. I knew what it was immediately. Patricia never hosted without an audience. Her home was exactly what you'd expect, a large colonial in a gated community, professional landscaping, a kitchen that photographed beautifully and was rarely actually cooked in. The kind of house designed to remind visitors of a particular kind of success. I arrived alone. Simone had offered to come, but I told her to stay home with the kids. This was not her battle, and I did not want her caught in the crossfire of whatever Patricia was planning. Douglas opened the door with that commercial real estate smile he wore everywhere. Loretta, so glad you could make it. As if I'd been invited for something pleasant. The living room held what I privately categorized as Patricia's full cast. Her 2 adult sons, both present with wives. Clarence's cousin Raymond, who was easily influenced, and Patricia knew it. A neighbor couple who had no real business being there, except that Patricia liked witnesses. And Patricia herself, moving through the room in a cream blouse and tailored slacks, playing gracious hostess the way some women play a long-practiced instrument. The dinner was 60% passive aggression served alongside actual food. You must be finding the house so big now, Patricia said while cutting her chicken. All that space for one person. I manage, I said pleasantly. Of course you do. She smiled. You've always been so independent. Clarence used to worry about that, actually, whether you'd be okay if anything happened to him. Set down my fork very quietly. Clarence worried about a great many things. That wasn't one of them. Raymond shifted uncomfortably. One of Patricia's daughters-in-law suddenly became very interested in her salad. Douglas leaned in from across the table. The thing is, Loretta, Dad Clarence, the way he talked about that building to Patricia over the years. Douglas. I looked at him directly. Clarence's wishes were documented, clearly and legally. Patricia dabbed the corner of her mouth with her napkin. Your lawyers claim that. Don't have lawyers yet, I said. That filing is still on my kitchen table. A short silence. Well, Patricia said, leaning back slightly with a smile that didn't reach anywhere near her eyes. That's either very confident or very foolish, Loretta. I genuinely can't tell which. I picked my fork back up. I know. She studied me for a moment. You know what your problem has always been. You act like you're the smartest person in any room you walk into. I said mildly. I just act like I've done my homework. Table went quiet in that specific way that means everyone heard something they're going to think about later. That night I sat alone on my back porch for a long time. The Savannah summer doesn't really cool down after dark. It just softens slightly, the heat becoming something you move through rather than fight against. Crickets everywhere. The smell of cut grass from the neighbor's yard. I had a glass of sweet tea that had gone warm and I wasn't drinking it anymore, just holding it. I thought about Clarence. Specifically, I thought about a Tuesday evening 3 years before he got sick, when we had sat on the same porch after dinner and talked about the future the way couples do, when they've been together long enough that the future feels like something you're building together rather than something happening to you. He had talked about retiring from the practice in maybe 5 years, turning the patient list over to a younger dentist, keeping the building, renting the apartment upstairs, living simply. No drama. Just the two of us, and the roses and maybe more travel than we'd managed, while Simone was growing up. "You think Patricia will make trouble when we're old?" he had asked me once, half joking, not entirely. I had said I didn't know. I knew now. The thing about spending 18 years investigating financial fraud is that you develop a particular relationship with documentation. Most people treat paperwork as a burden. Forms to fill, records to file, things to sign and forget. I had watched too many cases collapse because good people trusted memory over paper. I had watched too many guilty people walk free because the right document didn't exist at the right moment. So over the course of 31 years of marriage, I had kept records of everything that mattered. Not obsessively, quietly. The way you keep a garden. Consistent, unhurried, because you understand that things grow slowly and are lost quickly. Clarence and I had updated our estate documents 18 months before his diagnosis. Standard review, nothing dramatic. And then, 8 months before he died, when the practice conversations with Patricia had started and Clarence himself had grown concerned, we had done something additional, something specific. He had written a letter, notarized, witnessed by 2 people neither of us had told Patricia about. In it, he stated plainly that the practice building and the attached apartment belonged solely to me upon his death, that this reflected his clear and uncoerced intention, and that any future claims to the contrary were made against his explicit wishes. I had filed that letter in a plain brown folder in my home office, between a copy of our mortgage payoff receipt and Simone's original birth certificate. Patricia's attorneys didn't know it existed. That was not an accident. I called an old colleague the following Monday morning. His name was Gerald Watkins, and we had worked together for 11 years inside the Office of Inspector General, Health and Human Services. Gerald had retired 2 years before me and now did private consulting work, mostly expert witness testimony in civil cases involving healthcare fraud. He was 71 years old, moved slowly, talked slowly, and had the sharpest legal mind I had encountered in nearly 2 decades of federal work. "Patricia Voss Henley," he repeated after I had explained the situation. "Douglas Henley's wife, the commercial real estate man. You know him." "I know of him. He had a situation about 6 years ago, nothing prosecuted, but there were questions about some property transfers." Gerald paused. "Loretta, are you representing yourself?" "For now." A long pause. "You know what you're doing." "I know exactly what I'm doing." "Then I'll make some calls," he said simply, "and I'll be in the gallery when you need me." That was Gerald. No drama, just presence. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in late October. I woke before sunrise, the way I always had before significant proceedings. That particular stillness of a house at 5 in the morning, the refrigerator hum, the distant sound of a garbage truck 2 streets over. I made coffee strong and sat at the kitchen table in the dark with both hands wrapped around the mug. Savannah courthouse mornings have a particular quality. The old buildings downtown hold the night air longer than the newer ones. By the time I climbed the courthouse steps at 8:30, the sky was that pale gray gold that happens in Georgia October, cool enough finally to wear a proper coat without suffering. I had dressed simply, dark navy slacks, a gray blouse, a coat I had owned for 12 years that fit well and showed nothing. I wore no jewelry except my wedding ring and small pearl earrings that had been my mother's. I had pulled my hair back neatly. I looked, I knew, like someone's quiet grandmother on her way to a church auxiliary meeting. That was entirely intentional. Simone was waiting at the bottom of the courthouse steps with 2 coffees, her face doing that particular combination of love and anxiety that I had learned to read across 37 years of motherhood. "You okay?" she asked, handing me the cup. "I'm breathing," I said. "Mom, that's not." "I know," I smiled at her. "I'm okay, baby, I promise." She studied me carefully. "You seem very calm." "I am calm." "That's actually more worrying." I laughed softly, which surprised her. She laughed too despite herself, then immediately looked guilty about it. "They're already inside," she said, lowering her voice. "Patricia, Douglas, both of her sons, 3 attorneys, Mom, 3. "I see 4 problems with that sentence," I said, "and none of them concern me." She stared at me. "Who are you?" I patted her arm gently. "Your mother, let's go in." The lobby of the Chatham County Courthouse has that particular institutional stillness of old government buildings everywhere. Marble floors, security checkpoint, the faint smell of floor wax and old paper. I spotted Patricia's group immediately near the far end of the security line. She was wearing a designer suit in deep burgundy, pearls, heels that were expensive and impractical. Douglas stood beside her looking solemn in a way that clearly required effort. Her 2 sons flanked them, and surrounding the whole arrangement were 3 attorneys in pressed suits, each carrying binders thick enough to suggest they were preparing for a corporate acquisition rather than a property dispute over a dental practice on Whitaker Street. Patricia saw me the moment I cleared the metal detector. That smile appeared, the particular smile of someone who has already written the ending of the story. "Loretta," her voice carried just enough for the people nearby to hear. "I wasn't sure you'd actually come." I kept walking at the same pace. "Good morning, Patricia." Her older son, Marcus, looked at Simone with something between discomfort and apology. Marcus had always been the more decent of the 2. His wife studied the marble floor. Douglas stepped slightly forward. "Loretta, I want you to know this isn't personal. It's really about what Clarence would have wanted for his family legacy." "Clarence's wishes are documented," I said pleasantly, not stopping. "We'll discuss them shortly." One of the attorneys, the youngest, early 30s, expensive haircut, glanced at me briefly with that particular expression I had seen 10,000 times across 18 years of federal work. The look of someone scanning for weakness and finding what appears to be an easy target. I had spent my entire career being underestimated by men in expensive haircuts. Patricia stepped slightly closer as I passed, close enough that I could smell her perfume. Sharp, heavy. The kind that announces itself 3 rooms in advance. "You should have settled when Douglas offered," she said quietly. "This is going to be unpleasant for everyone." I turned and looked at her directly. "You used to visit Clarence every Sunday when he was in that recliner, barely able to keep his eyes open. You held his hand and talked about your childhood, and every single visit eventually, you brought up the building." Something shifted in her face. "I was there, Patricia," I said simply. "I was always there, you just stopped noticing me." I walked into the courtroom. The room itself was smaller than I expected. Old wooden benches worn smooth from decades of use. An American flag beside the judge's bench. The particular quality of silence that courtrooms hold before proceedings begin, something between anticipation and dread. I sat alone at the respondents' table. Patricia's legal team spread their materials across the petitioner's table with the organized efficiency of people who had done this many times and expected to win. Simone sat in the gallery behind me. I could feel her anxiety from 3 feet away. Gerald Watkins had settled quietly into a seat near the back of the gallery. He gave me a small nod when I glanced back. I opened my folder, plain brown leather, thin, organized. The younger attorney across from me looked at my folder with visible relief. He thought the thinness meant weakness. That relief was going to cost him. The bailiff announced the judge. Everyone stood. Judge Clara Odom entered from the side door carrying a case file and a coffee mug, which I appreciated. She was late 50s, sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, natural gray hair cut practically short. She moved with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had been doing this work long enough to have stopped performing it. She scanned the courtroom as she settled into her chair. Her eyes moved from Patricia's assembled legal team to my single thin folder. She paused there for just a moment. Something in her expression suggested she had seen this configuration before and found it interesting. "We're here on a petition contesting estate distribution," she said, reviewing her file. "Petitioner is Patricia Voss Henley. Respondent is Loretta Voss." She looked up. "Mrs. Voss, I see no legal representation listed for you today." "No, Your Honor. I'm representing myself." Patricia's lead attorney, the oldest of the three, silver-haired, practiced, allowed himself a brief professional smile. He had clearly decided this was going to be straightforward. "Very well," Judge Odom said evenly. "Let's proceed." Patricia's lead attorney stood and delivered his opening with the smooth confidence of a man who charged $400 an hour and knew it. He described Patricia as a devoted sister who had watched her brother's final months with growing concern. He described me as an isolated caregiver who had limited family access and gradually positioned myself to benefit exclusively from the estate. He used the phrase undue influence 11 times. I counted. He spoke for nearly 12 minutes. When he finished, the courtroom had the specific atmosphere of people waiting for a response from someone they expected to fold. I organized my papers quietly. Judge Odom looked toward me. "Mrs. Voss, would you like to respond?" I stood slowly. My knees reminded me of their age, as they always did in cool rooms. I looked at the judge calmly. "Your Honor," I said, "the petitioner's attorney stated that I limited family access to my husband during his illness. I'd like to ask 3 questions about that claim before we proceed." I turned briefly toward the lead attorney. "Did your team speak with any of my husband's oncology nurses at Memorial Health?" He hesitated. "We reviewed medical records." "Did you speak with the nurses directly? Yes or no?" "No." "Did your team request hospice visitation logs from the month of August or September?" A pause. "That wasn't considered relevant." "Yes or no?" "No." "Did your team speak with Dr. Anand Mehta, my husband's primary oncologist, regarding his end-of-life care recommendations?" The attorney's jaw tightened slightly. "No." I nodded once and sat back down. "Thank you, Your Honor. That's all for now." The courtroom was very quiet. Judge Odom looked at the lead attorney with an expression that was professionally neutral and personally unimpressed. "Counsel, you've made significant claims regarding caregiver isolation without apparently reviewing primary source documentation." "Your Honor, we have witness declarations." "Proceed," she said, in a tone that meant the opposite of reassurance. The first break came 90 minutes into the hearing. Patricia's team had submitted their core evidence: financial statements, a declaration from Douglas claiming Clarence had expressed verbal intent, a declaration from Raymond, Clarence's cousin, who I strongly suspected had been coached, and a letter from one of Patricia's sons describing, vaguely, a conversation with Clarence about the practice's future. I had listened to all of it with my hands folded on the table and my face giving away nothing. 23 years of federal hearings teaches you that patience is a weapon that most people don't recognize as one. During the break, Simone sat beside me in the gallery. She was trying very hard to look calmer than she felt. "They have a lot of paper," she said quietly. "Paper isn't the same as truth," I said. "Mom," she paused, "are you actually going to be okay?" I looked at her. "Do you remember when you were 11 and that girl at school told everyone you had cheated on your science project, the one you had spent 3 weeks on?" She nodded slowly. "Do you remember what I told you?" She thought for a moment. "You said the truth doesn't need a loud voice. It just needs to be in the room." I smiled. "Go get yourself some water, baby. It's about to get interesting." She stared at me for a long moment with an expression I couldn't fully read. Then she stood up slowly, touched my shoulder once, and went to find the water fountain. From across the room, Patricia watched me with narrowed eyes. She had expected tears by now. She had expected requests for settlement discussions. She had expected the quiet widow to behave like a quiet widow. I opened my folder to the second section. My hand rested briefly on the edge of the notarized letter. Clarence had signed it on a Tuesday afternoon when the light through the hospital room window was soft and low. I had been sitting beside him. He had read it twice before signing, slowly, carefully, and when he was done, he had looked at me with those steady brown eyes of his and said, "Make sure it counts, Loretta." I intended to. Court resumed at exactly 2:00. The afternoon light came through the tall courthouse windows at a low angle, the kind of October light that makes everything look slightly more serious than it already is. Patricia had reapplied her lipstick during the break. Her lead attorney had straightened his tie. They had regrouped and recalibrated, and they were ready to push forward. What they didn't know was that I had been ready since Tuesday morning 11 months ago, when I had sat in my car outside the funeral home after making Clarence's arrangements and thought, very clearly and very quietly, she is going to come for the building, and I am going to be prepared. Judge Odom settled into her chair and reviewed her notes briefly. "We'll continue with respondent's evidence. Mrs. Voss, you indicated you have documents to submit." "Yes, Your Honor." I stood carefully. "I'd like to submit Exhibit A." The bailiff carried copies to the judge and to opposing counsel. I watched the younger attorney scan the first page. I watched the exact moment his expression changed. That particular tightening around the eyes, the slight forward lean. The way he turned immediately to the older attorney beside him and said something low and urgent. Patricia leaned toward her lead attorney. "What is it?" He didn't answer immediately. Good attorneys never answer panicked clients immediately. Judge Odom read quietly for nearly a full minute. Then she removed her glasses and looked up. "Mrs. Voss, this appears to be a notarized estate protection letter signed by the deceased." "Yes, Your Honor. Signed by my husband Clarence Voss 8 months before his death. Witnessed by 2 independent parties. Notarized by a licensed notary in Chatham County. In which Mr. Voss explicitly states," she glanced down briefly, "that the practice building and attached apartment at 412 Whitaker Street belongs solely to his wife, Loretta Voss, and that any future contest of this arrangement is made against his direct and documented wishes." "Yes, Your Honor." Complete silence. Patricia's lead attorney stood carefully. "Your Honor, we would question the circumstances under which this document was produced, if Mrs. Voss had undue influence over the deceased." "Counsel," Judge Odom said evenly, "the document includes a specific statement from the deceased asserting that it was made, and I'm reading directly here, voluntarily and without coercion or influence of any kind. Are you prepared to challenge the notarization?" A pause that lasted slightly too long. "We would request time to review." "You'll have that opportunity," she said. "Continue, Mrs. Voss." I sat down quietly. Across the room, Patricia was whispering something sharp to Douglas. He was staring at the table. Her older son Marcus had his eyes closed briefly in a way that suggested he was not entirely surprised and was not entirely on his mother's side of this. Patricia turned and looked directly at me. Her expression was something I had seen before in federal proceedings. Not quite anger yet, something earlier than anger. The specific look of someone realizing that the room they thought they controlled has changed shape around them. I looked back at her steadily and said nothing. Because sometimes silence unsettles people more completely than any argument ever could. The lead attorney attempted to recover. He was good at his job, genuinely. He reframed his narrative carefully, pivoting away from the isolation argument and toward the claim that Clarence had been emotionally compromised during his illness, and therefore the letter itself could be questioned. He used careful language, diminished capacity, vulnerability during terminal illness, the natural anxiety of a dying man being guided by a spouse with legal knowledge. It was a reasonable pivot. I had expected it. When he finished, Judge Odom looked toward me. "Mrs. Voss." I stood again. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit Exhibit B." The bailiff distributed copies. This time I watched Patricia's face rather than her attorney's. She picked up the document, read the first line, then the second. Her face drained. Judge Odom read quietly, then looked up with an expression that had shifted from professional neutrality to something considerably more focused. This appears to be an email exchange between the deceased and the petitioner. Yes, Your Honor. 31 emails over a 14-week period during my husband's chemotherapy treatment. The exchange begins in June and ends in late September, approximately 6 weeks before his death. The judge read further. The courtroom was completely still. Even the court reporter had slowed. Then Judge Odom looked directly at Patricia. Mrs. Carter, Mrs. Voss Henley, did you repeatedly contact your brother during his chemotherapy treatments to discuss the property on Whitaker Street? Patricia straightened immediately. I was concerned about family legacy. Yes or no, please. A pause. We had conversations. Did you, in an email dated August the 14th, tell your brother that he needed to, and I'm reading directly, get everything sorted before it's too late, and Loretta ends up with everything your father built? The courtroom temperature changed completely. Patricia's lead attorney stood. Your Honor, private family communications taken out of context. Did you write this email? Judge Odom asked Patricia directly, her voice carrying the particular patience of someone who expects an honest answer and is prepared to wait for it. Patricia's jaw tightened. I was under enormous stress. My brother was dying. Mrs. Voss Henley. The judge's voice did not rise. It simply became more precise. I'm going to ask you one more time. Did you write this email? Yes, Patricia said finally. The word came out clipped and cold. Douglas put his hand briefly over his eyes. Marcus stared at the table. Anna, Simone, I heard my daughter draw a sharp breath behind me. I did not turn around. I kept my hands folded on the table and my eyes forward, and I let the truth do what truth does when it finally gets to stand up in a room unobstructed. The older attorney requested a brief recess. Judge Odom granted 10 minutes. The moment the judge stepped out, Patricia turned toward me with an expression that had moved well past polished and landed somewhere rower and angrier than anything I had seen from her before. You kept those emails, she said. Her voice was low and tight. Clarence forwarded them to me, I said simply. He was concerned. You've been planning this. I've been prepared, I said. Those aren't the same thing. Douglas put his hand on Patricia's arm. She shook it off. You think you've won something, she said. I looked at her carefully. Patricia, your brother spent the last months of his life worried about property instead of resting. He spent energy he didn't have documenting his own wishes because he didn't trust his family to honor them. That's not something I won. That's something all of us lost. She stared at me. Something moved across her face that wasn't quite what I expected. Not shame exactly. Something more complicated. Something that looked, briefly, like a woman who had gone very far down a road and only just looked up to see where she'd ended up. Then her attorney returned and touched her shoulder, and she straightened, and the moment closed. Court resumed. Judge Odom settled back into her chair with the quiet efficiency of someone whose 10-minute recesses were genuinely 10 minutes. She reviewed her notes, adjusted her glasses, and looked across the courtroom with an expression that had become noticeably more deliberate. Mrs. Voss, she said, you indicated earlier that you have additional evidence. Yes, Your Honor. I opened the final section of my folder. Clarence had asked me to record the phone calls in August. Not for revenge, he had said. He was very clear about that. He was too tired for revenge. He just wanted there to be a record. Something that existed outside of memory, because he knew that memory could be argued with and recordings could not. I had used a simple recording application, nothing sophisticated, just honesty captured in audio format. Your Honor, I said, I'd like to submit Exhibit C, an audio recording of a telephone call between my husband and the petitioner, made on August 22nd with my husband's full knowledge and consent. The recording documents a conversation in which the petitioner made specific statements regarding the estate while my husband was undergoing active chemotherapy treatment. Patricia's lead attorney was already on his feet. Your Honor, we object to the admissibility. On what grounds, counsel? The recording was made without the petitioner's knowledge. Georgia is a one-party consent state, I said quietly. My husband consented to the recording. That satisfies the legal requirement. A pause. Judge Odom looked at the attorney. She's correct. Objection overruled. Proceed, Mrs. Voss. The bailiff connected the audio device. And then Evelyn's, Patricia's, voice filled the courtroom. Cold, sharp, unmistakable in its intent. Clarence, if Loretta actually loved you, she would put that building back where it belongs. In the family, your family, not hers. Simone made a sound behind me, soft, involuntary. The recording continued. You're not thinking clearly right now. The medication, the treatments, you're exhausted. You need someone looking out for what's really best for you. Then Clarence's voice. Tired, thin, unmistakably him. Patricia, stop. 2 words, that was all. The sound of a dying man asking his sister for peace. Not dramatic, not loud, just exhausted and clear and deeply, heartbreakingly human. Judge Odom stopped the recording. Nobody moved. I had heard that recording many times over the past 11 months. I had sat in my kitchen and listened to it in the dark at 2 in the morning during the worst nights of grief. And every single time, those 2 words broke something open in me that took a while to close again. Even now, in this courtroom, with everything I had prepared and everything I had built toward this moment, I felt the weight of it settle across my shoulders like something physical. Patricia, stop. He had deserved better than to spend his last months fighting his own family. That truth hurt more than anything Patricia had ever said to me directly. The courtroom remained quiet for a long moment after the recording ended. Patricia was frozen. For the first time since I had known her, through 31 years of family dinners and holidays and the particular performance of a woman who had always understood exactly how she wanted to be perceived, she looked lost. Not powerful, not polished, just lost. Douglas stared at the table in front of him with an expression I couldn't read and didn't try to. Marcus, the older son, had his head slightly bowed. His wife was looking at her hands. Judge Odom removed her glasses and set them on her case file with a quiet deliberateness that made the entire room pay attention. Mrs. Voss Henley, she said. Her voice had not risen, but it had become something considerably more serious. This court has now reviewed documentary evidence of direct, repeated pressure applied to a terminally ill individual regarding estate matters. This court has heard audio documentation of statements made during a period of significant medical vulnerability. She paused. I want to be very clear. The court finds these actions deeply troubling. Patricia's lead attorney leaned toward her urgently. She shook her head at whatever he was saying. Pride, I thought. Pride making an intelligent woman make a foolish decision at the worst possible moment. Your Honor, the attorney said carefully. Perhaps a brief mediation period would allow the parties to. No, Patricia said sharply. Her own attorney froze. Judge Odom looked at Patricia with an expression of professional patience that contained, underneath it, something considerably less patient. Mrs. Voss Henley, I strongly advise you to consult with your counsel before refusing court-suggested mediation. She manipulated my brother, Patricia said. Her voice had an edge to it now that was past strategy and into something more personal and more dangerous. She was always in that room, always managing everything, always making sure he depended on her. Mrs. Voss Henley. My brother built his life around that practice. My father started it. It belongs to this family. Your brother's written and documented wishes state otherwise. Judge Odom's voice was firm now, entirely firm. And this court takes documented wishes from a deceased individual seriously, particularly when evidence suggests that pressure was applied to alter those wishes. Patricia stopped. The room was completely still. Judge Odom looked across both tables. Colonel Hayes, she paused, corrected herself. Mrs. Voss, would you like to make a final statement before this court rules? I stood slowly. I looked at the judge, then briefly at Patricia, then at the worn wooden floor between us. I had thought about what I wanted to say in this moment many times. I had planned it carefully, the way I had planned everything. But standing here, in this quiet courtroom with October light coming through the tall windows and my daughter crying softly behind me and Clarence's voice still somehow present in the air, I realized that what I had planned wasn't quite what I needed to say. My husband spent 31 years building something, I began. My voice was steady and I kept it soft because soft carries further in a quiet room than loud ever does. Not just the practice, a life, the kind of life that doesn't announce itself. He showed up every single day. He remembered his patients' children's names. He stayed late without telling anyone. He came home tired and still helped Simone with her homework and still asked me about my day. I paused. Cancer takes things away piece by piece. Most people know that. What people don't always understand is that the person you love is still entirely present inside what's being taken. Clarence never lost his mind. He never lost his judgment. He never lost his understanding of what he wanted and what he valued. I glanced briefly toward Patricia. He knew exactly who was sitting beside him. He knew exactly what those conversations were about. And he spent energy he could not afford in the final months of his life, making sure that his wishes were protected. Not because he was weak, because the people around him gave him reason to. The room stayed silent. The lake house, I stopped, steadied myself. The practice. That building is where he spent 30 years of mornings. I am not keeping it out of stubbornness or greed. I am keeping it because he asked me to. Because his father's name is still on the original deed, and his hands repainted that waiting room twice, and his voice is still somehow in those walls if you're quiet enough to hear it. I swallowed carefully. I did not spend 31 years loving that man, just to let his memory be rewritten by people who spent his final months fighting over what he'd leave behind. Complete silence. Even the reporters in the back had stopped writing. Patricia had her eyes closed, real closed, not performance. Something that looked, finally, like the actual weight of things landing somewhere it should have landed months ago. Judge Odom looked at me for a long moment. Then she looked down at her case file. Then she looked up. This court finds overwhelming evidence supporting the validity of the deceased's documented estate intentions, she said. Her voice was measured and clear. The petition contesting ownership of the property at 412 Whitaker Street, including the attached residential apartment, is denied in full. Simone made a sound behind me, a soft, broken sound that was relief and grief arriving at the same moment. Furthermore, Judge Odom continued, this court finds credible evidence of coercive conduct directed toward the deceased during periods of medical vulnerability. While this court will not pursue immediate referral at this stage, let me be unambiguous. She looked directly at Patricia. What this court has witnessed today was a serious and deeply inappropriate attempt to override the documented wishes of a dying man. This court does not take that lightly. Any further legal action against Mrs. Voss regarding this estate will be reviewed with that context firmly in place. She closed her case file. The property remains solely under the ownership of Loretta Voss. We're adjourned. Outside the courthouse, the October air was cooler than the morning had been. A thin line of clouds had moved in from the coast, and the light had gone from gold to soft gray. Simone found me on the courthouse steps and held on for a long time without saying anything. I let her. After a while, she pulled back and looked at me with her face doing several things at once. You won, she whispered. Your father won, I said. I just showed up. She wiped her eyes roughly with the back of her hand, which she had done since she was 7 years old, and somehow that small, unchanged thing made my chest hurt in the best possible way. Gerald Watkins appeared beside me quietly and shook my hand with both of his. Clarence would have been insufferable about this, he said. Absolutely insufferable, I agreed. He would have told that golf story at every dinner party for the next 10 years. Gerald smiled and walked slowly toward the parking lot. I turned. Patricia was standing near the bottom of the courthouse steps, slightly apart from her attorneys, who were having a quiet, urgent conversation near the curb. Douglas had walked ahead. Marcus had stopped and was looking back at his mother with an expression I recognized as the particular exhaustion of a child watching a parent refuse to be comforted. Patricia was alone. I almost kept walking, Part of me wanted to, had earned the right to. But I looked at her hands and I saw that they were trembling slightly. And I thought about what Clarence had said once, years ago, about his sister. She was different when we were young, before the money, before Douglas. She used to be the one who made everybody laugh. I walked over. She looked up when I stopped beside her. Her expression was stripped now of everything except something tired and old and genuinely lost. "Margaret," she stopped. "Loretta." She seemed to have trouble locating the right register for this moment. Her voice came out smaller than I had ever heard it. "You could still pursue this further, the audio alone." "I know," I said. She looked at me. "Why won't you?" I thought about it honestly before answering. Because I spent 18 years watching what punishment does to people. It changes behavior, sometimes, but it doesn't change the thing underneath that caused the behavior. I paused. "You were terrified of losing him, and instead of sitting with him in that fear, you turned it into a fight over property. And now he's gone and you lost the fight too, and you're standing here alone." I looked at her steadily. "That's already the hardest thing there is. I don't need to add to it." Her eyes filled, real tears, not the polished kind. "I loved him," she said. Her voice broke slightly on it. "I know you did," I said. "So did I." We stood there for a moment in the cool, gray October air. Two women in their 60s on courthouse steps, connected by grief and separated by choices that couldn't be undone. Not friends, not enemies anymore. Something more complicated and more honest than either. "The apartment," she said finally, quietly. "The one above the practice. Clarence always talked about." "I know what he talked about," I said. She nodded, looked down at the sidewalk. I turned and walked back to where Simone was waiting. 3 months after the ruling, I drove out to the practice on a Saturday morning. Dollars had retired the previous spring, finally. After 34 years of knowing everyone's name. The new dentist who had taken over the patient list was a young woman named Dr. Priya Anand, 29 years old, first generation, the kind of careful and quietly excellent that Clarence would have loved immediately. She had kept the waiting room magazines exactly as outdated as Clarence always had, which told me everything I needed to know about her judgment. I stood in the doorway of the empty apartment upstairs for a long time. The floors Clarence had refinished. The windows he had installed on a hot July weekend 20 years ago when Simone was at summer camp, and we had ordered pizza every night because neither of us had the energy to cook. The wall where he had put up shelving and measured 3 times and still managed to hang it slightly crooked, which he had refused to acknowledge until the day he died. Love leaves fingerprints on ordinary objects. Grief lives inside the specific, not the grand gestures but the crooked shelf, the coffee mug he always used, the way the floorboards creak in a particular pattern near the window. I sat down on the floor with my back against the wall and my coffee cooling in my hands, and I let the quiet be what it was. Not empty, not lonely, just quiet. There is a difference. Empty feels like something has been taken. Quiet feels like something is being held. The winter came gently that year. Simone brought the grandchildren, her 2, aged 9 and 6, for Thanksgiving at the Savannah house. My grandson Eli found an old photograph tucked in a box in the study. He came running with it, holding it carefully the way children carry fragile things. "Grandma, is this you?" I looked at the photograph, taken at a federal courthouse in Atlanta, 2003. I was 40 years old in that photograph. Dark suit, straight posture, a stack of case files under one arm, eyes that had already seen too much and hadn't yet learned to carry it lightly. "Yes," I said. He studied it seriously. "You look scary." I laughed harder than I had in months. "Good," I said. "That helped sometimes." "Were you important?" he asked. Children ask the real questions, because they haven't learned, yet that adults usually dodge them. I thought carefully before answering. "I tried to be useful," I said finally. That felt like enough. He considered this with the grave seriousness of a 9-year-old, and then nodded like it made complete sense and ran back to his sister. Simone appeared in the doorway behind me. She had a dish towel over her shoulder and flour on her sleeve, and she was watching me with that expression she'd had since the courthouse. Curiosity, reassessment, something that looked like love with new dimensions added to it. "Mom," she said. Who exactly were you? Before us, before Dad?" I smiled at the wall for a moment. Then I turned around. "Come sit down," I said. "I'll tell you some of it." She sat, and for the first time in many years, I told her some of the true shape of things. Not everything. Some chapters are too heavy to carry into peaceful rooms, but enough. Enough for her to understand that the woman who grew roses and made sweet tea and sat quietly through 31 years of family dinners had once sat across federal hearing tables from people who had stolen millions of dollars from sick people's health care. Had dismantled elaborate fraud networks with nothing but documentation and patience. Had learned, over 18 years, that the quietest person in the room is almost always the most dangerous one if they know what they're doing. Simone listened without interrupting. Outside the window, the Savannah evening was going soft and blue, the kind of early winter dusk that feels like a held breath before something gentle arrives. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Does it bother you," she asked, "that people don't know?" I thought about it honestly. "It used to," I said. "When I was younger, I wanted the work to be seen. You do when you're working that hard." I looked at my hands. "But then you get older and you realize that being seen and being known are two different things. Your father knew me, you know me. The people I worked alongside know what we built." I glanced toward the window. "I don't need a courthouse crowd to confirm what I know about myself." Simone reached over and put her hand over mine for a moment. Said nothing. That was enough. A few weeks before Christmas, a handwritten note arrived in the mail from Judge Clara Odom. Short, professional. She wrote that she had found the proceedings meaningful and that she respected how I had conducted myself throughout. And then at the bottom, in slightly different handwriting as if she had paused before adding it, she wrote something I read 3 times. "The law gives us tools. Dignity is what we bring ourselves. You brought both." I put the note in the plain brown folder, behind the notarized letter, behind the emails, behind the transcript of Clarence's 2 quiet words. "Patricia, stop." Behind all of it. Where things go when they're finished, but not forgotten.